When it comes to the boss fights, Resident Evil has plenty of them, that's for sure. From massive man-eating plants to giant invisible snakes, the franchise continues to explore creative monsters for some of the most insane boss fights in horror games. And while we covered other elements of this category, like the hardest boss fights of the franchise, I've never actually given you guys my top 10 games that feature the best fights of the franchise. So here we are. There's really only 2 rules for today's video. 1. DLC bosses will not be included in today's video. Only bosses featured in the main story of the game. And the second rule applies to remakes. For this list, or at least for the most part, I'm including both the originals and the remakes as one entry. Before we get started though, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to my channel if you like the content that I bring you guys. Also leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. Anyway, my name is Ruben with Nerds Based Games, and this is my top 10 Resident Evil games with the best boss fights. Let's get it. Number 10, Resident Evil 7.
Oh, now with me, we're gonna settle this!
It feels wrong putting RE7 this low on any list because of how much I truly enjoyed this game. But while it features some pretty iconic boss fights, the game doesn't stand up in terms of quantity against most of the entries on this list. Still, there's a lot to appreciate in terms of the bosses in this game, enough to at least earn it a spot on today's list. Most of the boss fights in Resident Evil 7 are actually against Jack Baker. His fight in the garage is a bit underwhelming and feels more like a cinematic cutscene versus a fight, but the rest of the encounters would Jack pick up from there. While he stalks you throughout the main house, the next official fight against him is the chainsaw fight in the basement. It's probably one of the most fun boss fights in this game. But his final fight was probably the most impressive and honestly the hardest. You'll need to shoot a bunch of weak spots scattered on his enormous molded form in a small contained area. There are a few other boss fights in this game, including an underwhelming final fight against Evelyn, a terrifying fight against Mia at the start of the game, and a few of those fat molded creatures. But there is one fight that stands out above all others in this game: Marguerite Baker. Easily one of, if not the most disturbing boss of the franchise, Marguerite Baker is the perfect mix of terrifying and challenging as she takes the form of a spider-human hybrid with long limbs and some very interesting design choices. Each time you take a shot at her weak spot, Marguerite scampers away to hatch some of her obnoxious giant insects and then pops up when you least expect it. Number 9, Resident Evil Revelations. I'll admit, there's a lot I don't really enjoy about the first Revelations game. Quint and Keith were some of the most annoying characters of the franchise, and the second half of the game felt more like a spy movie versus a survival horror game. However, there were a few things about Revelations that I really did like. For example, the boss fights. When you take a look at the boss fights of Revelations, there were some significant amount of interesting encounters. The comms officer, aka the Skagdead, has one of the most terrifying entrances as he continues to call out Mayday in a very disturbing and distorted voice. Rachel's section of stalking the player throughout the ship is one of the scariest moments of that generation's Resident Evil games. There's a few other pretty unique encounters, including a boss with an extremely strong shell that deflects most bullets, and a giant Malicado that you'll need to use a chopper to defeat. But the standout performance is without a doubt Ultimate Abyss, aka Jack Norman. The final boss of Revelations is one of the most difficult boss fights of the series, as Jack Norman takes the form of a tyrant but with a twist. Instead of the traditional walking bosses that we are used to from previous entries of the franchise, Ultimate Abyss can teleport and create illusions that throw you off. Defeating him is both challenging and satisfying, as you'll need to be on your A game in order to hit his weak spot before he attacks you. Number 8, Resident Evil 6.
Him again? Friend of yours? Or like an ex-girlfriend? Guy doesn't know when to quit.
RE6 may be viewed as the worst numbered entry of the franchise, but you can't deny that the game features a ton of boss fights. Sure, the quality of these fights don't really match up with other entries, but it's hard to avoid putting it on today's list when you take into consideration that this game has the most boss fights of the franchise thanks to the 4 unique campaigns of the game. I mean, for me to go through every single boss fight of this game would literally take up most of this video. So instead, I'll go over some of my favorites, like Deborah and Leon's campaign. Her fight is both tragic and one of the most exciting of the game. Fighting Deborah as you travel through the underground mines will keep the entire encounter feeling fresh and exciting. Battling Haos with Pierce's mutated arm added a new gameplay experience that felt unique to Resident Evil. And as much as I pick on Jake's campaign about the direction that it took with the Bruce Lee combat system, I can't deny it added a new level of uniqueness to the gameplay, especially when battling Usanok. Giant invisible snakes, an Ada Wong lookalike, and the enormous Agromon monsters are just a few other insane boss fights of Resident Evil 6. However, you can't talk about the iconic fights of RE6 without mentioning Derek Simmons. I'll admit, fighting this guy gets a bit annoying thanks to the bullet sponge that he is and the amount of transformations that he has. But when you get past how long and frustrating these fights against him are, you can't help but admire the amount of transformations Simmons has. I mean, the guy even outshines Nemesis and William Birkin in this department. Let's see, you have his centaur form that you fight on a moving train and again on the side of a building. Then there's a T-Rex transformation that you have to take down with the help from Ada and a chopper. And finally, you have the last fight against him where he's a fucking giant fly. Yeah, you can't make this shit up.
Back for more.
Number 7, Resident Evil 3.
Jill!
Brad!
We've gotta... Jill! Help! No!
Whether you look at the original game or the remake, each features some unique boss fights against one of the most iconic monsters of survival horror, Nemesis. In the remake, he's actually the only boss fight of the game, as Jill will need to battle multiple transformations of him. And while this can seem a bit repetitive and fighting the same monster over and over again, each encounter with Nemesis feels unique and different. In one encounter, you face him on a rooftop as he's trying to burn you alive with a flamethrower. In another fight, he's in his dog form where he leaps from building to building. Plus, you have his final form, which is arguably one of the hardest boss fights of the franchise, especially on Inferno mode. Looking at the original version of the game, we see a boss that's not Nemesis, the Gravedigger. Basically a giant earthworm. This creature is very similar to the Gulp Worm in Code Veronica, and while it's not extremely impressive as a boss fight, it is a nice change of pace from the countless versions of Nemesis that you'll be facing off against. Also, in the original, you fight more classic form Nemesis than in the remake. For example, the Clock Tower fight, and if you choose to face him, the RPD fight against Nemesis are in his standard form. The Clock Tower version, depending on the choices you made throughout the game, could actually have a rocket launcher. On top of the fights mentioned above, there are a few other encounters with Nemesis, most of which are optional. In fact, these optional fights against the father of stalker enemies is exactly what made Resident Evil 3 Nemesis so damn exciting. Choosing to face Nemesis would mean unlocking unique and useful rewards, while avoiding him would mean less resources spent. Either way, despite technically being the same boss over and over again, Resident Evil 3, thanks to Nemesis, absolutely deserves its spot on today's list. Number 6, Resident Evil 2. Similar to Resident Evil 3, RE2 features a boss that you will fight multiple times in different forms throughout the main story, William Birkin. This technically applies to both the remake and the original, however the remake changes things a little with different final bosses for each character. Still, even though William Birkin is fought again,
Jesus.
and again,
It's still alive?
and again,
Alright, we end this here.
each fight feels significantly different, especially in the remake's case. In that version of the game, you face Birkin while he has his signature lead pipe under the RPD station. Then, after escaping into the sewers, Leon and Claire once again face Birkin with the help of a crane. This fight challenges the player to weaken Birkin enough to knock him off of the structure with a crane that requires timing and patience. Then G3 Birkin shows up in the Umbrella Labs, where Leon and Claire have to battle probably the most difficult version of him, especially for Leon thanks to his resistance to shotguns. Claire, however, faces G4 as her individual final boss fight of the remake, and then the second run protagonist will face his final form on a train, which is basically an unload all of your bullets into him kind of fight. In the original game, we get a lot of similar fights with him, except the final fight of Scenario A being a two-part fight against two transformations of Birkin, one of which is a dog transformation that is never seen in the remake. Other boss fights that appear in either or both versions of the game include the giant alligator or G offspring, with the latter being turned into a regular enemy in the remake. However, the other major boss of Resident Evil 2 outside of Birkin is Mr. X. In the original game, he actually only appeared in the second scenario of the game. However, in the remake, he appeared in both runs and both characters play through. Regardless, Mr. X's presence adds a new level of fear as he stalks the player throughout the RPD. Technically, the player doesn't need to fight and kill him until the Super Tyrant fight at the end of Leon's remake campaign or the original second run. But you'll find that sometimes putting him down for a few moments might be necessary. Either way, Mr. X combined with William Birkin's multiple transformations are enough to earn Resident Evil 2 a spot on today's list. Number 5, Resident Evil Code Veronica. Code Veronica is seriously impressive when it comes to the boss fights, especially considering that the game uses fixed camera angles. On top of that, Code Veronica actually features some of the hardest boss fights of the entire franchise. That is somewhat surprising considering that in most cases, bosses in fixed camera Resident Evil games tend to be the easiest. However, thanks to the way Code Veronica handles each encounter and the fact that most bosses of the game have an instant kill attack, the difficulty of the bosses here are insane. Still, it's because of the difficulty of these bosses that really make this game so high on today's list. Fighting a tyrant on an aircraft where it can knock you out of it, killing you instantly. Fighting a blind, poisonous Nosferatu on the top of a rooftop where it can knock you off of the roof, again, killing you instantly. Or taking on a giant worm, a giant black widow, or a giant ant. Okay, there's obviously a pattern there with the last few boss fights mentioned, but hey, each of these fights feel completely different from each other. So if you're looking for a Resident Evil game that'll challenge you more than any other entry, especially where bosses are concerned, then look no farther than Resident Evil Code Veronica. Number 4, Resident Evil 5.
Now, let's finish this once and for all. I think the odds are fair. 2 on 2. Right, Jill. Seven minutes is all I can spare to play with you.
One thing that the action trilogy aka RE4 through RE6 did right are the boss fights. Due to the change of perspective with over-the-shoulder gameplay, boss fights could now be more creative and three-dimensional. Not saying that fixed camera angles prevented the lack of innovation behind boss fights, as you'll see with one specific entry above this one, but it's hard to deny the fact that most of the best boss fights of the franchise come from over-the-shoulder or first-person perspectives, not fixed camera angles. Looking at Resident Evil 5, there's plenty of iconic boss fights to look at here, each feeling vastly different from each other. Irving, while I find him annoying and his boss fight frustrating to deal with, feels pretty unique and different from most fights of the franchise. In order to beat him, you'll need to use guns on the side of a ship to weaken him enough in order to make him attack you up close. Then, using your best weapons, you take his ass down. Excella, a massive boss fight so big that you'll need to use a satellite gun to take her weak spots down faster. U8, basically a giant ass crab monster that you'll need to break through its shell in order to hit its weak spot. Or even its smaller siblings, the Ouroboros experiments, in which you'll need to use an incinerator to quickly defeat one of them and a flamethrower on the other. Probably some of the most iconic fights in this game though are the ones against the most infamous villain of the franchise, Albert Wesker. Considering that you never get to fight Wesker in any of the previous installments of the franchise, facing off against Wesker in RE5 was actually a pretty big deal. especially since you get to face him multiple times in this game, including a 2v2 match against him and Jill, and even a boss fight on the top of an active volcano. Number 3, Resident Evil 2002 Remake. Seriously, I actually wanted to put this one as number 1, but putting Resident Evil, and more specifically the 2002 remake of it, as number 1 on this list would completely be giving in to my personal bias. With that aside though, the 2002 remake on its own easily deserves a spot in the top 3 of the franchise at the very least. Sure, the boss fights are nowhere near as difficult as other entries on today's list, but they are some of the most interesting fights, each with unique solutions to defeating them. As I said earlier, it's really hard to make fixed camera boss fights interesting, but if there is any game that did it better than any other out there, then it would be the 2002 remake of Resident Evil. Instead of focusing on traditional and more direct fights, Resident Evil uses creative solutions. For example, Neptune, a giant shark, is killed by following a specific set of directions. Plant 42 is weakened and in Jill's campaign, killed by creating the V-Gel chemical. Still, Resident Evil doesn't allow you to chicken out in every fight. Sometimes it'll force you to face a boss head on. The Yawn fight in the library or the Tyrant at the end of the game are 2 examples of that. The remake version of Resident Evil also features unique changes, including 2 additional boss fights, one of which is a fight against a Crimson Head. While technically not a boss fight, this encounter feels like one considering it's the only circumstance where you'll actually have to kill a Crimson Head in order to leave the area. The second is Lisa Trevor, a stalker-like enemy that follows you throughout certain sections of the game until your final confrontation with her under the Spencer Mansion. Number 2, Resident Evil Village.
Shit! Stay back!
The exit's underwater. You're done.
I don't have time for this. Miranda sent you to slow me down? You're pathetic.
If you know anything about me, then you'll know that Village is far from my favorite of the franchise, mainly because I'm not a major fan of action horror over survival horror. So seeing this entry and the next entry take the top 2 spots kind of breaks my heart a little bit. Still, I can't deny how awesome and vastly different the boss fights are in Village. First-person perspective allows Resident Evil to do different and more unique boss fights compared to most of the encounters that we have seen in the series thus far. A beautiful example of this is the unsettling, yet surprisingly satisfying fight against Angie and House Benevito. While not exactly a boss fight per se, this ultimate game of hide and seek was a lot of fun and thrilling to complete. Leading up to this encounter, you have to outrun a giant fetus monster, so yeah, there's also that. Of course, the real shiny moments of Village comes from the main boss fights. Lady D's dragon form is massive as she flies around and attacks you as you make your way through a tower. Heisenberg, while feeling completely out of place for a Resident Evil game, feels unique as you'll need to battle his ability to control metal via a fucking tank. Yeah, you have to use a fucking tank. Maru, who is one of the most disgusting looking creatures of the franchise, will attack Ethan in a swamp-like battlefield that'll require the player to dodge acid rain and long-range attacks. And of course, Mother Miranda, the final boss of the game. This fast-paced fight will challenge the player to react quickly to different attacks, which require the player to dodge, block, and shoot at precise moments during this final fight. Add all of these to some of the mini bosses of the game, like Lady D's daughters, and it's hard to find any Resident Evil game that has better boss fights than this. Well, there is one. Number 1, Resident Evil 4 and its remake.
Hasta luego.
God, I thank you for your gift.
You want to get ugly? Let's get ugly.
There's a reason why Resident Evil 4 is a lot of people's favorite Resident Evil game. While not my personal favorite of the franchise, even I can't deny that RE4 delivers the best boss fights of the series. Taking a deeper look at Resident Evil 4, you'll notice that there really isn't a single bad boss fight in this game. In fact, every single boss encountered in this game is literally top tier. While there are plenty of mini bosses in the game, for the sake of time, I'll focus primarily on main bosses of Resident Evil 4. The first one we'll take a look at is Los Lagos. This lake monster uses a unique mechanic where you'll need to harpoon the beast while trying to avoid its attacks and obstacles that'll knock you out of the boat, forcing Leon to race back to safety before this Jaws-like monster eats you whole. Then you have Chief Mendez, who was a nice combination of offense and defense, as the player will need to be ready to dodge via a QTE or a knife parry if you're playing the remake, while also taking the opportunity to shoot gas canisters quickly as Mendez picks them up to deal major damage. Salazar was a disturbing yet challenging fight, as his mutated transformation in both versions of the game proved to be one of the most challenging fights. Well, assuming you didn't use a rocket launcher or his kryptonite, golden eggs, and a Verdugo. A personal favorite of mine, was easily the scariest boss fight of the game, and his quick movements and stealth attack always kept you on your toes. The list goes on and on, including the final fight against Saddler and of course U3, which I'm counting since it was in the original game despite it appearing in DLC for the remake only. There's not enough time to go into detail about each fight of Resident Evil 4, but I feel like I can't move on without at least covering one of the most iconic fights of the game, Jack Krauser. Whether you prefer his QTE knife fight in the original game or the more hands-on approach of the remake, you can't deny that both versions of his final fight with his mutated arm are perfection. With so many great and iconic fights in a single game, it's no wonder why Resident Evil 4 claims the #1 spot. Well, that's it for today's episode of Nerds Based Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Does Resident Evil 4 has the best boss fights of the franchise, or is there a different game that deserves that title? Let me know down below. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more survival horror content. Also, leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerds Based Games. Take care.